Hello, everyone, and welcome back to History 202. Last week, we talked about a collision of cultures that took place when Europeans, Africans, and Native Americans came into sustained contact during the 16th century. This week, I want to take you into the next part of that story. And I want you to imagine something for just a moment. It is the year 1607. You have spent months crossing the Atlantic Ocean. You have left England behind. You don't know exactly what is waiting for you on the other side. There is no Amazon. There are no grocery stores. There's no hospital you can drive to. There isn't even a road. You arrive in a place where people already live, people whose languages you don't speak, whose political systems you don't understand, and whose knowledge of the land is vastly greater than yours. And now someone tells you, we're going to build a permanent English colony here. I'd like you to stop and think about that. Why would anyone do this? Seriously, why leave England? Why risk your life crossing the Atlantic? Why walk into an environment you know almost nothing about? And the answer is there wasn't just one answer. Some people were looking for economic opportunity. Some were interested in England's competition with Spain and other European powers. Some were looking for religious freedom, or more accurately, the opportunity to build a community according to their religious beliefs. And some were simply looking for a chance to make a life that wasn't available to them in England. That mixture of motivations is important because it helps explain why the English colonies didn't all become the same place. So let's start with Jamestown. In 1607, the English established Jamestown in Virginia. Now, when we hear Jamestown, we often picture a group of brave settlers arriving in a new world and beginning the American story, but reality was considerably messier, quite different than the movie. These people were not arriving in some empty wilderness. They were entering a world already inhabited by native peoples, including the Powhatan people. And the English colonies had a problem. They were not particularly well prepared for what was coming. Imagine arriving somewhere where you've never been, and your first priority is survival. Where's the food? Where's the clean water? What can you eat? What can kill you? Who can you trust? And perhaps most importantly, how are you going to make money? Because Jamestown wasn't established simply as a humanitarian project. There was an economic motive behind it. The investors who supported colonization expected the colony eventually to produce something of value. But there was a problem. You can't make money if you're dead. And a remarkable number of the early colonists came dangerously close to finding that out. Disease, starvation, environmental problems, inadequate preparation, and conflict all threatened the colony. And then something happened that changed Virginia's future. Tobacco. Tobacco changed everything. John Rolfe and the development of the profitable tobacco crop helped transform Virginia. Now, here's where I want you to think beyond the textbook. Tobacco is a plant. That's it, a plant. But sometimes something as ordinary as a plant can completely reshape a society. Why? Well, because tobacco was profitable. And once something becomes profitable, people want more of it. More tobacco means more land. More land means more labor. More labor means more people. And suddenly you have a chain reaction. Tobacco equals land. Land equals labor. Labor equals immigration. Immigration equals wealth. Wealth equals social classes. Social classes equal political consequences. So when you read about tobacco this week, don't just think tobacco was Virginia's cash crop. That's a fact. Instead, ask, what did tobacco do to Virginia? How did it change who owned land? How did it change who worked? How did it change the relationship between wealthy planters and ordinary settlers? And what happens when a society becomes increasingly independent on a labor force that was very little power? Those questions take us somewhere much more interesting than memorizing a crop. And now let's just back up for just a moment because there's another part of the story that we cannot afford to overlook. The English were not alone. Native peoples were already living throughout these regions, and the relationship between native peoples and English colonists was complicated. There was trade, there was diplomacy, there was cooperation, there was cultural exchange, and there was violence. Sometimes the same people who traded with one another one year could be fighting one another later. Why? Because the fundamental problem never went away: land. The English wanted more land. Native peoples already lived on that land, and the English understanding of land ownership was not necessarily the same as native understandings of land, political authority, or territorial control. So, when you read about conflicts between native peoples and English colonists, don't reduce the story to they didn't get along. Ask a better question: what did each side believe it was entitled to, and why? That's a much more interesting historical question. Now, I want to leave Virginia behind for a moment and let's travel north because something very different is developing in New England. And this is where religion becomes incredibly important. The Puritans who established Massachusetts Bay were not simply saying, let's go to America and see what happens. They had a vision. They believed they were creating a community that had a special relationship with God. And this brings us directly to John Winthrop. You have read portions of his a model of Christian charity this week, and I want you to think about something as you consider his words. Is Winthrop describing America, or is he trying to create it? That's a very different question. When Winthrop talks about wealth and poverty, he isn't saying that everyone should be economically equal. In fact, he accepts social and economic differences. But he argues that people who have more have obligations toward people who have less. And then he makes a fascinating argument. The care of the public must oversway all private respects. Now, think about that. The public good should outweigh private interest. How comfortable are you with that idea? And here's the question I really want you to wrestle with: where is the line between individual freedom and responsibility to a community? That's not just a 17th century question. We still argue about it today. And then Winthrop gives us the phrase you have probably heard of before: a city upon a hill. You've probably heard politicians use that phrase, but before we turn it into a modern political slogan, we need to understand what Winthrop actually meant. He was warning his fellow colonists. Essentially, he was saying everyone is watching you. If this community succeeds in living according to the covenant they made with God, it will be an example. But if they fail, everyone will see that too. Now, that's fascinating because the Puritans aren't simply saying we want to live somewhere else. They're saying we want to build something that demonstrates what we believe. Now ask yourself, what happens when a community believes it has a special mission? Does that create unity? Absolutely. But can it also create conflict? Absolutely. Because once you believe your community has a special mission, you have to decide who belongs, who doesn't, what happens to people who disagree. And those questions will become increasingly important as colonial society develops. So now let's just take a step back. Virginia and Massachusetts are both English colonies, but look at how different they are becoming. Virginia develops around agriculture, tobacco, land, and labor. New England develops around religious communities, towns, family settlement, and a very different social structure. Neither one is simply the English model. They're adapting, they're changing, they're responding to their environment. And this is one of the most important ideas I want you to take from this week. Colonies don't simply reproduce the societies they came from. People bring ideas with them. They bring religion, they bring political traditions, they bring assumptions about class and authority. But then they encounter a new environment, a new people, a new economic opportunities, new problems, and those things change them. That's how societies develop. The question is what I want you to think about. So, as you finish chapter 2 this week, I want you to stop thinking about the colonies as a list, like Jamestown, Virginia, Massachusetts, Puritans, tobacco, Native Americans, representative government. Those are all facts. But history is about understanding the relationships between those facts. Why did Virginia develop the way they did? Why did New England develop differently? How did religion shape politics? How did economics shape labor? How did presence of native peoples affect English settlement? And perhaps the biggest question of all, were the English colonies becoming something that England never intended them to become? Because that's where we're ultimately headed. The colonies began as a part of the English Empire, but over generations, these people developed their own experience, their own institutions, their own economic interest, and eventually their own sense of identity. We aren't anywhere near the American Revolution yet, but the ingredients are beginning to appear. And that's what makes this period so fascinating. So here's your challenge for this week. As you read chapter 2, don't just ask what happened, ask why did it happen? And when you go one step further, what did it cost? And when you read Winthrop, don't simply ask, what did he say? Ask, what kind of society did he want to build? And then ask yourself whether the society he imagined actually became the society that developed in New England. That's the work of history. You're not just memorizing the past, you're trying to understand people who made decisions without knowing what would happen next. And remember, that's what makes history so interesting. They didn't know how the story ended. Neither did Jamestown, neither did Winthrop, and neither did the people who would eventually create the United States. We'll pick up on that story next week, and I'll see you later.